it seems to be increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for Russia to take all of the 4 provinces that they have notionally annexed nearly 2 years ago now, of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. They have most of Luhansk. They have probably 2/3 of Donetsk, maybe 3/4 of Zaporizhia, maybe 3/4 of Kherson, roughly. Now, could they demand, give us the rest or we won't have a ceasefire? Again, very hard for them to press that. So I just don't see a ceasefire that would involve anything less than a freezing of the front line roughly where it is now, with each side saying that they don't fully accept the outcome, but are willing to stop fighting.
After 9 hours of talks in Jeddah, Ukraine has accepted a US plan for an immediate 30-day ceasefire with Russia. In a joint statement, the US said it would immediately resume intelligence sharing and security assistance to Ukraine, and it seems this is already happening. Well, this all represents a significant change in relations between the US and Ukraine after President Zelensky's meeting with President Trump at the White House descended into an acrimonious shouting match. So Keir Starmer has congratulated the two leaders on a remarkable breakthrough and said Russia must now agree to a ceasefire and an end to the fighting too. Speaking after the talks, President Zelensky's Chief of Staff, Andriy Yermak, called on Russia to back the ceasefire plan.
Russia needs to say very clearly, they want peace or not. They want to end this war, which they started, or not. And this is today the position of Ukraine was absolutely clear. It's absolutely understandable. And now it's important that the people in the world will understand, because this war, it's created the many crises.
Well, President Trump has said he'll take the plan to the Russians. He hopes to meet President Putin this week.
Now we have to go to Russia and hopefully President Putin will agree to that also, and we can get this show on the road. We can get this horrible war where 2,000-3,000 soldiers a week, every week, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 sometimes. I get the reports. And they're not American soldiers. They're Ukrainian and they're Russian. But people are being killed outside of that. People are being killed in the cities as things explode throughout the cities. And we want to get that war over with.
Well, Alexandra Kara is a former advisor to the Foreign and Defence Ministries of Ukraine. And earlier he gave me his reaction to what's been agreed.
It seems that we overcome all those troubles after the last Friday's meeting in the Oval Office, when there was a quarrel, and certainly it's not in our interest to have bad relations with the United States. Even though, as a consequence of those talks, our European partners showed a huge support to Ukraine, and certainly we highly appreciate it. The major thing that I like from the joint statement and the decision that has been made is that resumption of defense aid to Ukraine and the intelligence sharing, which are really important factors in our defense. And certainly it's a pretty strong signal from the United States to Russia, because Russians oppose it in general. We showed our commitment to peace, and we tried to seize this initiative from the Russians. It's really important that we engage Europeans, so they will be around the table when there will be some talks with Russians, which is important because we see that Europeans are on our side, and the United States are either on the side of Russia or are trying to portray themselves as an impartial mediator. And it's important that we brought to the table the humanitarian aspects, like returning of the prisoners of war, detainees, and the most important, Ukrainian children. And I believe it's going to be a hard topic for Russia because they believe they have not kidnapped Ukrainian children and they have not committed an act of genocide.
Yes, a huge amount appears to have been agreed in these initial talks, 9 hours of talks. But of course, one of the crucial factors now is how Russia responds. Donald Trump, President Trump himself, has said he hopes to be speaking to the Russians very soon. Do you think that they will be prepared to sign up to this 30-day ceasefire?
Well, first of all, we signed with Russia many bilateral agreements since 1991, and certainly after the illegal annexation of Crimea and the proxy war on Donbass, and the Russians violated it again and again. So there is no we do not trust Russians at all, and certainly with this proposal that we have between Ukrainians and Americans now, the missing part is the monitoring of this ceasefire. Interim ceasefire.
And how concerned are you that there was no mention from the American side of any kind of security guarantees? Yes, they are resuming the military support, the intelligence sharing, which of course is hugely important on the ground right now. But for any ceasefire to actually work, presumably you do need some kind of security guarantee from the United States, given your completely understandable lack of trust in the Russians.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's possibly was a Ukrainian concession during these talks, not to mention the requirements that we need to have security guarantees even for the interim ceasefire. And actually, I hope that the Americans will change their position in the future when these talks about the last and comprehensive peace, or whatever the Americans call it. We have our own formula that begins with just and then lasting and other peace. And each and every word means a lot. And I hope that Americans would not rule out our membership in NATO in the future, certainly not tomorrow and possibly not in the next year, but it's the most viable option for our security.
Just finally, we have got this commitment from the US to resume its military assistance, to resume its intelligence sharing. Donald Trump is talking tonight about inviting President Zelensky back to the White House. How significant do you think all of that is?
I believe we should judge not just words and gestures, but the result of that. If war would stop, let's say in months or half of a year, it would be a huge success of Mr. Trump and others. But I do not believe in it, because the Russians believe they can outmaneuver us not on the battlefield where they are failing, even though they are advancing a bit, but they cannot conquer the whole of Ukraine. But they try to get this wedge between Europeans and Americans, between Americans and Ukrainians. So it's not the words that matter, but actions. And once again, security guarantees is something that we cannot agree on any type of last peace with Russia, because we're sure that they will come against us for the third time. Territorial integrity is really important. What should we do with those territories that Russia illegally annexed and just has written into its constitution, or with those territories that we keep, but the Russians claim that they belong to them? It's really important thing. It's not about just about territory. It's about people living there and suffering from the Russian brutal occupation. And finally, about justice. We want to bring Putin and his cronies to justice, and all those who committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide to justice. Because one of the reasons of this war is not just imperial drive of Putin and his encirclement, but the impunity that the Russians enjoy for previous crimes against Ukrainians, Georgians, Moldovans, and many other nations in Russian Federation and beyond. So to cut this vicious circle, we need to bring Russia to justice.
Well, that was Alexander Kara, a former advisor to Ukraine's foreign and defense ministries, setting out some of the complexities of the situation. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said it's up to Russia to make the next move.
We'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball's now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
Well, tonight, the Russian Foreign Ministry has said it doesn't rule out contacts with US representatives in the next few days. Robin Niblett is a distinguished fellow at Chatham House and the Institute's former director, also an author of various books on Russia. Robin, a very good evening.
Good evening, Carol.
Pretty non-committal signals coming from Moscow so far. How do you think Russia will respond?
Well, first of all, I think it's hardly surprising you've got a non-committal response from Russia, given the drone attack, it seems, relatively successful drone attack that the Ukrainians carried out on Moscow at precisely the same time as the Ukrainians and the Americans were standing, one could say, shoulder to shoulder diplomatically, however briefly, in Jeddah today. So I'm sure they're smarting and trying not to say something frustrated that would set President Trump off. But look, we're really in the early stages here of the process. We all know what the Russian objectives are. Ukraine must be a vassal state, a part of Russia, or a failed state. I think only one of those three outcomes is one that they would find acceptable. The question is what's going to be on the table as a result of where we've got to on the conflict. So I think they're going to, we're in early stages. They're going to keep the fighting going for the moment. And if Steve Witkoff, Trump's preferred negotiator, is accepted into Moscow, we might hear a little bit back further. Honestly, I don't know. All I know is that the conditions for a ceasefire are not yet met. The fact that the Ukrainians are willing to do a ceasefire is one thing. But the question is, what is Russia going to demand in return for that ceasefire? And we just don't know what those things are yet. They've made some comments about how the ceasefire would be protected, where the Russians have made it clear they do not want European troops on the ground. But I'm sure that for the Ukrainians, I'll stop here, for the Ukrainians to go back to the kind of Minsk process of some toothless peace monitors that the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, provided last time, would be a non-starter. So I just think there's a long way to go yet.
Yes, clearly this is very much a first step, a significant one, given the acrimonious exchanges in the White House between President Zelensky and President Trump. But Russia, in recent days, weeks and months, has been making gains in the war. I just wonder what would be in it for them to accept a ceasefire at this stage.
Well, from what we understand, they've made some gains in recovering territory, Russian territory, in the Kursk region that the Ukrainian forces moved into a few months ago and that North Korean forces have been trying to help the Russians retake. However, we know that despite making some quite significant gains through the latter part of 2024 in the Donetsk eastern region, that advance has notably slowed. It's been brutal fighting. As you also may know, some of the highest casualties of the war on the Russian side have been taking place in the last 3 to 4 months. Some estimates between 1,000 and 1,500 casualties on the Russian side a day. That's dead and injured, obviously. And there are reports, well, it's interesting, Pokrovsk, which is one of the cities that was expected to fall about 3 months ago, has not. Now, they've talked about encircling it, but in the recent months, we've had Ukrainians making some very limited but noticeable small gains back of territory that they'd lost. So I'd say we're hitting kind of a bit of a stalemate in eastern Ukraine. And one thing President Putin will want to do is perhaps try to take through the negotiations what he is struggling to take through military force. Because obviously,
I was just going to say the idea of the Americans is that this 30-day ceasefire will be a starting point. But as we were hearing from Alexander Kara, there is a huge amount to establish. I mean, which bits of territory are going to fall to the Russians, which are going to remain a part of Ukraine? Who is going to provide the security guarantees? As Alexander Kara was saying, quite understandably, the Ukrainians don't trust the Russians, and somebody has to provide those guarantees.
This is why it can be incredibly difficult. I mean, the best I could see through the fog and haze and confusion and uncertainty is that it will be impossible for Ukraine to take territory back militarily, and therefore it'll be impossible for it to demand, and I don't think the Americans will demand, that the Russians give it up through negotiation for the ceasefire. But conversely, it seems to be increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for Russia to take all of the 4 provinces that they have notionally annexed nearly 2 years ago now Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. They have most of Luhansk. They have probably 2/3 of Donetsk, maybe 3/4 of Zaporizhia, maybe 3/4 of Kherson, roughly. Now, could they demand, give us the rest or we won't have a ceasefire? Again, very hard for them to press that. So I just don't see a ceasefire that would involve anything less than a freezing of the front line roughly where it is now, with each side saying that they don't fully accept the outcome, but are willing to stop fighting. And that is, as you know, the kind of Korean solution. But the difference with the Korean solution is that America, still has today some 29,000 troops deployed there. There is a mutual security guarantee, which is very firmly upheld. And of course, President Trump is saying he's not going to provide that for the Ukrainians, which is where the Europeans come in. And all I'd say is the Europeans are probably going to have to make a decision as to whether they'll go there without a US backup. I mean, a really significant US backup.
Yes, and a huge amount to discuss. John Healey, the Defence Secretary, is going to be talking more about that with European and other allies tomorrow. Robin Niblett of Chatham House, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Carol. Bye.